There is a number that followed Jerry Jerome Anderson for 23 years, not his sentence, not the number of counts on his indictment, not the number of years he served. The number that followed him was 56. 56 kilograms of crack cocaine. That is what the federal presentence investigation report attributed to his operation as a documented minimum, the amount the court found as a matter of fact and entered into the sentencing record, the number that placed his offense level at the absolute ceiling of the federal guidelines in effect at the time of his 1991 sentencing, and that stayed there through every appeal, every guideline amendment, every motion his attorneys filed over the next 2 decades. In 1991, a federal judge in Macon, Georgia, looked at Jerry Anderson and sentenced him to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. The charge that carried that sentence was not simple distribution. It was a continuing criminal enterprise under Section 848 of Title 21 of the United States Code. People who study that statute have a simpler name for it. They call it the Kingpin law. By 2017, he had filed 5 separate motions to reduce that sentence. He had lost all 5. He had watched other men caught up in the same investigation walk out of prison years earlier, released under the same guideline amendments that kept failing to reach him because the 56 kilograms made him too large to fit through any door that reform opened. The same number that made him a kingpin in 1991 made him unreachable by every form of mercy, the system designed for the next 23 years. Then Barack Obama picked up a pen. This is the story of what Jerry Anderson built in Macon, Georgia in the late 1980s, what it cost him, what he did about it for more than 2 decades from inside a federal cell, and what happened on one January afternoon in 2017 that changed the calculation entirely. Macon, Georgia is not a city that most people outside the South think about very much, which is itself a kind of statement about what the city has been through. It sits in the middle of Georgia, a former railroad hub that built its economic identity around the textile mills and the freight lines that ran through it in the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the 1970s, those mills were shutting down. The working class black community that had built its life around the industrial base was absorbing the departure of that base with the limited resources available to communities that do not have the political weight to demand that their economic problems get treated as national priorities. That decline followed a pattern that repeated across the industrial South and the Rust Belt at roughly the same time. Textile production moved overseas in search of cheaper labor, and the freight and rail jobs that had once supported it thinned out along with it. Macon's downtown, which had thrived when the mills and the rail yards were running at capacity, began losing the tax base that paid for the schools and services that neighborhoods like Tyndall Heights depended on. The city did not collapse all at once. It hollowed out gradually over the course of a decade in a way that made the decline feel less like an event and more like a permanent condition. By the time Jerry Anderson was a teenager, that condition was simply the water he had grown up swimming in. Tyndall Heights was a housing project in Macon that produced, among other things, the 5th of 8 children raised by a single mother after their father left when the child was around 5 years old. Jerry Anderson's mother worked at the medical center. By his own account, she found a way to put food on the table every night, even when there was not much of it. He has described Tyndall Heights with a specificity that does not invite pity. It was rough, not unusual, rough. And he makes the point that growing up in it did not feel like poverty because everybody around him was in the same condition. It felt like Tuesday. The realization that the rest of the country was not doing this came later, when he was old enough to understand what the rest of the country looked like. He found his way out the way a lot of kids from projects try to. Football. He was the 9th grade MVP at a state championship level. College scouts took notice. He already had one child by the time the partial scholarship arrived, but it arrived, and for 1 year, he was playing college football in Tennessee with pro scouts in the stands, and a different life genuinely within reach. Then his girlfriend back home got pregnant again. A phone call, a bus ticket back to Macon, and the football story was over before it started. He came home with nothing waiting for him except a construction job and a mother who needed help. That is a familiar story. It is the story of 1,000 young men from 1,000 housing projects in 1,000 American cities in the 1970s and 1980s, and in most of those stories, the structural conditions that ended the opportunity are less interesting to the people doing the structuring than the choices the individual makes in response to finding the door closed. What Jerry Anderson did next was find a different door. The education that made what came later possible did not start in Macon. It started in Los Angeles. A woman Anderson met at Georgia Power had connections to Haitian drug suppliers running product up from Florida. Through those connections, sometime in 1983 going into 1984, Anderson went west. Not to set up his own operation, not yet. He went to work for established dealers in Los Angeles, learning a business at a scale that the streets of a mid-sized Georgia city had never shown him. He was paid a flat rate, while the operation around him generated what he estimates as $90,000 to $120,000 a week. He was a 20-something kid from a Georgia housing project, watching what was possible when someone ran a real operation instead of a street-level hustle, and he was absorbing everything he saw. Los Angeles in that period was also the epicenter of something larger than any one operation. The mid-1980s were the years when crack cocaine, a smokable and comparatively cheap form of the drug, began spreading out of Southern California into cities across the country, carried along the same distribution networks and personal connections that men like Anderson were building. The gang architecture of the Crips and the Bloods was hardening into the territorial system that would define the city for decades, and the drug trade both funded that system and was shaped by it. What Anderson watched in Los Angeles was not just one profitable operation. It was the early machinery of a national epidemic, still small enough that the people inside it did not yet have a name for what they were building. The detail he tells about that Los Angeles period is the one that tells you the most about who Jerry Anderson actually was. He was not from Los Angeles. He had no business being trusted on the streets of a city that was in the middle of the gang wars of the mid-1980s, where the Crips and the Bloods were establishing the territorial architecture that would define Southern California's gang world for the next 3 decades. But by his account, his personality bought him passage that his background never would have. He was funny. He was easy to be around. He knew how to read a room, how to know when a joke would ease a situation and when it would make it worse. Both sides of the street let him post up and sell because he was, in his own telling, just a nice guy. That ability to navigate rooms, to make people comfortable, to present himself in a way that caused others to trust him rather than see him as a threat is not a small thing. It is a specific kind of social intelligence that translates across environments, and in the story of Jerry Anderson, it translates in 2 directions at once. It helped him build an empire in the late 1980s. It is also, by his own account, what allowed him to spend 28 years in federal prison without a single violent incident on his disciplinary record. He came back to Macon in 1985 and started from the bottom. Family first. A sister, a cousin, moving small weight through a car wash, a stretch of road, a string of cars cruising past a drop point. The woman with the Florida connections had taught him what he needed to know about product quality, about counting money, about not getting touched. He started small and he paid attention to everything he had seen in Los Angeles. What he says happened between 1985 and 1989 in Macon is the part of the story that he tells with the precision of a man who has spent 30 years turning it over in his memory. The operation grew from grams to kilograms. Then came a second trip to California in 1987, and the conviction that powder cocaine was a dying business and crack cocaine was the future. He came back to Macon and reorganized. By his account, the spots multiplied. Pleasant Hill, Alphabet City, William Street, each location running its own crew with its own structure. A man over the spot, a package man, a lookout, all on a weekly payroll. $6,000 a week for the man running the spot, $1,000 for the lookout. Paid on time, every time, no excuses. That payroll discipline is worth pausing on. The single most common reason that illegal drug operations get exposed is not surveillance or informants. It is the human failure that comes from disorganization. When people are not paid reliably, when money goes missing, when the hierarchy is unclear, the conflicts that result generate the noise that law enforcement listens for. An operation that pays people on time, that maintains clear lines of accountability, that runs like a business, is harder to see from the outside because it generates less internal conflict and less of the chaos that makes noise. Anderson says he understood this. The federal indictment that eventually came down confirms that whatever he was running had the organizational characteristics of something structured enough to charge under the Kingpin statute. The continuing criminal enterprise statute itself is not a charge prosecutors reach for casually. To convict under Section 848, the government has to prove that the defendant occupied a position of organizer, supervisor, or manager over at least 5 other people in a series of drug violations undertaken in concert with those people, and that the defendant derived substantial income or resources from the enterprise. It was written into federal law specifically to target the layer of the drug trade above the street level dealer, the people running the operation, rather than working inside it. Most drug prosecutions in America never approach that threshold because most drug cases involve individuals or small informal groups rather than a documented hierarchy with defined roles and a weekly payroll. The fact that federal prosecutors were able to charge Anderson under this statute and make it stick before a jury tells you something about how deliberately he had built the thing he was running. At the operation's peak in 1988 and 1989, he claims it was generating between $500,000 and $1.2 million per week. He estimates the total across those years at $30 to $45 million. Those figures come from his own telling. The federal court record does not put a dollar amount that large into its formal findings. What the record does confirm unambiguously is the 56 kilograms of crack cocaine found by the presentence investigation. That number, that specific finding of fact entered into the federal sentencing record, is the number that matters for the legal story that follows. The operation structure also reflected something specific about how Anderson thought about risk. He kept his family close to the money and far from the product. He gave his mother cash to bank quietly. No new cars in her name, no new house in her name. He was calculating years before any indictment that if federal prosecutors came after him, they would try to reach back through his family. He was designing the operation to prevent that reach. It is a detail that tells you he already understood, long before the handcuffs, exactly how the government would build the case against him. December 29th, 1989, early morning, Macon, Georgia. A close associate called Anderson at 4 or 4:30 in the morning asking for a ride. Anderson says he agreed. What followed was a drive full of small delays, a stop at the mall, a stop at the associate's mother's house, a stop to see his wife. Each pause was a small, quiet signal that something was wrong. Anderson did not read it that way. His own wife, he says, told him to trust the man riding next to him. So he relaxed. What he did not know, what he could not have known from inside that car, was that the associate had been arrested hours earlier on an unrelated charge and had already been talking to federal agents. The morning that ended his empire, the people closest to him were the ones telling him everything was fine. When the car rolled into the backyard where a deal was supposed to happen, the lights came up, federal agents. The associate ran and threw a bag containing approximately 2.5 pounds of crack cocaine into a trash can. He was caught. Anderson was arrested. He spent hours handcuffed to a chair in an interview room, telling himself this was manageable. A small possession charge, the kind you process in and walk back out of. That confidence held until investigators put the actual case in front of him. A 7-count federal indictment. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine and crack cocaine. Possession with intent to distribute. Operating a continuing criminal enterprise under federal law. Conspiracy to commit money laundering. 3 separate counts of money laundering itself. In 1990, a federal jury convicted him on all 7 counts. At sentencing in February 1991, the district court found that the operation involved at minimum 15 kilograms of crack cocaine, with evidence supporting a finding as high as 56 kilograms or more. Under the federal sentencing guidelines in effect at the time, that quantity placed his offense level at the absolute ceiling. There was no range. There was no judicial discretion to go lower. One sentence was available: life in federal prison. The judge imposed it: life on the top count, plus concurrent 25-year sentences on the lesser charges. Anderson says he slept for almost 2 weeks after the words landed. Guards checked on him. The human mind needed that long, apparently, to process the full meaning of "you are not going home." This is usually where the story ends. A man gets convicted. A judge hands down a sentence. The credits roll. Anderson's story did not end there, and what happened over the next 23 years is a specific kind of document about how the American federal sentencing system works, and in his case, how it failed to work. Crack cocaine sentencing has a documented and well-established racial disparity problem. For decades, federal law treated 1 gram of crack as equivalent to 100 grams of powder cocaine for sentencing purposes, 100 to 1. That disparity fell hardest on Black defendants in Black communities because crack cocaine was overwhelmingly concentrated in those communities, while powder cocaine moved through white and Latino networks that were treated with corresponding leniency. The disparity was documented, it was studied, it was criticized from every direction, including by federal judges who were forced to impose sentences they found excessive, and Congress spent years trying to walk it back. That ratio traces back to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, passed in the middle of a genuine public panic over crack cocaine's arrival in American cities. Congress set the 100 to 1 ratio quickly and with little of the deliberative process that usually accompanies federal sentencing law, in part because crack was new enough that lawmakers had almost no long-term data on its effects and leaned instead on media coverage and anecdote. The result was a statute that treated a person caught with 5 grams of crack the same way it treated a person caught with 500 grams of powder, even though both substances come from the same coca plant and produce the same drug once metabolized. The disparity was not hidden or disputed by the time Anderson was sentenced in 1991, It was already the subject of academic and legal criticism, and it would remain that way for another 2 decades before Congress acted. The first crack guideline amendment that might have helped Anderson came in 2006. Amendment 505 lowered the maximum offense level the guidelines allowed. His 56 kilograms still landed him at the top. Motion denied. The 11th Circuit affirmed. The 2008 Amendment 706 addressed the crack-to-powder ratio directly. Same math, same result. Denied. In 2010, Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act, reducing the crack-to-powder ratio from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1, and eliminating the 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession of crack entirely. It was the first piece of federal legislation to shrink a mandatory minimum drug sentence in roughly 4 decades. For a large number of people sentenced under the old ratio, it meant nothing changed automatically because the act was not made retroactive when it passed. Only later, through the Sentencing Commission's own guideline amendments and eventually the First Step Act in 2018, did retroactive relief become available to people already serving sentences under the old math. For Anderson, sitting in a federal facility in 2010, watching Congress finally admit what he had known for 2 decades, the Fair Sentencing Act's passage without retroactive reach for people at his quantity level was one more door that opened for other men and stayed shut for him. His own attorney at one point filed what is called an Anders brief, a formal document in which a lawyer tells the court on the record that they have reviewed the case and can find no argument worth making. That is a specific kind of professional concession. It means the lawyer looked at everything available and concluded there was nothing left to try. 2011, 2013, Amendment 750 twice, same denials both times. The crack quantity attributed to him was so large that no guideline reform built to address the disparity could ever pull his number down far enough to matter. Every mechanism Congress created to correct what it acknowledged had been wrong still left the 56 kilograms above the threshold where any of it applied to him. The final appeal reached the 11th Circuit as case 13-2945, argued October 16, 2014, decided November 19, 2014. Anderson lost 23 years, 5 separate motions, every single denial on a sentence handed down when George Herbert Walker Bush was in the White House. The people who had been caught up in the same investigation had been going home for years under the amendments that kept failing him. He had watched them leave. He was still there. Around 2015, a friend suggested filing for executive clemency, not a guidelines motion, not another appeal, a direct request to the President of the United States to commute the sentence that every other mechanism had failed to move. Anderson barely remembers doing it. He had spent 23 years watching the legal system exhaust every option it offered him and come back with the same answer every time. He did not believe a piece of paper was going to change anything. The Obama administration had made federal drug sentencing reform one of the more significant criminal justice priorities of its second term. By the end of his presidency, Obama had commuted more sentences than the previous 13 presidents combined, the majority of them drug cases from the mandatory minimum era when the guidelines produced sentences that even the judges imposing them found excessive. The Department of Justice had created a clemency initiative specifically targeting people whose sentences no longer reflected the standards Congress itself had revised. The goal was to identify people who, if sentenced today under current guidelines, would receive significantly shorter terms. That effort had a formal structure behind it. In 2014, the Department of Justice announced criteria for what became known publicly as Clemency Project 2014, working alongside outside organizations, including defense attorneys and advocacy groups who helped screen and prepare petitions from federal inmates. The criteria were specific: nonviolent offenders, no significant ties to gangs or organized crime beyond the operation itself, a clean or largely clean disciplinary record while incarcerated, and a sentence that would have been substantially shorter under the sentencing guidelines and policies in place at the time of the petition. The project processed an enormous volume of petitions in a short window, and the majority of the roughly 1,700 commutations Obama ultimately granted came out of that pipeline. It was, by design, built for exactly the kind of case Anderson represented, a person whose quantity-driven life sentence had outlived the legal consensus that produced it. Jerry Anderson was exactly the profile that initiative was designed for: a crack cocaine kingpin from the late 1980s, serving a mandatory life sentence under guidelines that had since been acknowledged to be racially disparate and legally excessive. A clean disciplinary record across 28 years of incarceration, no violent incidents, a man who had, by every institutional measure, behaved exactly as the prison system theoretically rewards people for behaving. January to the 17th, 2017, 3 days before the end of Obama's term, Anderson's name appeared on the commutation list. The Department of Justice record stated it plainly: prison sentence commuted, set to expire January 17th, 2020. Not freedom yet, 3 more years on paper. He says he did not know the letter was coming. It reached him through a counselor walking the floor with a stack of envelopes, almost passing his cell. He did not believe it when he read it. He also says it came attached to information that people in Macon had signed a petition asking that he not be released. The commutation came anyway. That detail, a city that had not forgiven him, and a federal process that decided forgiveness was not the city's call to make, is worth sitting with for a moment. Presidential clemency does not require community consent. It does not require that the people in the community where the crimes occurred be satisfied with the outcome. It is the exercise of a constitutional authority that exists specifically to correct outcomes the justice system itself produced but cannot undo through its own mechanisms. A follow-up motion, by Anderson's account, eventually converted the commuted sentence into something closer to immediate release. He walked out after 28 years. He was scared to step through the door. He stepped 1 foot out, then back in, twice. A guard told him nobody was going to shoot him for stepping outside as a free man. What happened after he walked out is the part of the story that is either genuinely moving or carefully constructed, and there is no way to see inside a man's chest well enough to know which one it is. What is verifiable is this: Anderson took a job at a Purdue processing plant, cutting chicken. He has said in multiple recorded accounts that the check from that job means more to him than any cash he ever counted at 3 a.m. Whether that is sincere or performed, it is a statement that can be traced through his own documented history. The only thing this man ever proved he could do well, besides running a drug operation, was work. He worked construction before the drug trade found him. He worked in the streets when the trade made that available. He worked the jobs available to a man with a federal drug conviction and a 28-year gap in his employment record when he came out. That gap matters more than it might sound like on paper. People released after decades-long federal sentences re-enter a labor market, a technology landscape, and a set of basic daily systems that have changed almost beyond recognition since they last participated in them. A man who went into a federal facility before cell phones were common and came out into a world run on smartphones and online applications is navigating something closer to a different country than a delayed job search. Add a felony conviction under the Kingpin statute to a resume with a 28-year hole in it, and the number of employers willing to take a chance narrows considerably. That a meatpacking paycheck could carry the emotional weight Anderson describes says as much about the difficulty of that re-entry as it does about any personal transformation. He has worked with youth outreach programs in Macon, walking into rooms with teenagers already caught up in gun violence. He co-wrote and performed a play about his life at the Douglas Theater, the historic Macon venue where Otis Redding once performed. He published a memoir. He has walked into the Bibb County Jail with the county coroner to talk to inmates. His message in those rooms is not sophisticated, and it does not need to be. You are never going to win selling drugs. From a man who ran an operation that federal prosecutors charged under the Kingpin statute, who lost 28 years of his life to the sentence it produced, the words carry a different weight than they carry from a counselor or a pastor who has never seen the inside of a federal prison. Some of the kids he has spoken to have called him from inside after being arrested for exactly what he warned them about. The Jerry Anderson story sits at the intersection of several things that American society has spent the last 2 decades trying to figure out how to talk about simultaneously. The drug trade he ran was real. The 56 kilograms of crack cocaine that the federal record attributed to his operation went into Macon communities that were already struggling. Crack cocaine did specific and documented damage to black communities across America in the late 1980s, the same communities that were producing the men who distributed it. The addiction it created destroyed families. The violence that surrounded the trade killed people. The specific human beings in Macon, Georgia, who became addicted to the crack that Anderson's operation distributed are not abstractions. They were people, and the sentence he received, life in federal prison for a first conviction on a non-violent drug charge, applied through a sentencing guideline that the United States Congress has since acknowledged created racially disparate outcomes that it did not intend and would not reproduce if it were designing the law today, is also a real thing. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is exactly the tension that the mandatory minimum era of federal drug sentencing produced and never resolved. The Obama commutation did not resolve it either. It moved one name from one list to another. It released one man from a sentence that the law itself now acknowledges was excessive after 28 years of that man's life had already been spent. The 55 kilograms and the sentence and the commutation and the chicken plant job are all part of the same story, and none of them cancel any of the others out. The kids in Macon who hear Anderson talk now do not know the numbers. They know the man in front of them ran something big enough that the federal government called it an enterprise, that they sentenced him to die in prison, and that he is standing in front of them instead of dying in one. They hear the warning in his voice, and they hear the specific weight behind it, and they decide what to do with it. He built something the federal government decided was a continuing criminal enterprise. He served 28 years of the sentence that decision produced. He filed 5 motions that the system denied, and then a clemency petition he filed out of exhausted habit, and one of those documents eventually reached the right desk on the right afternoon with the right name behind it. Some of what happened to Jerry Anderson was the system working. The prosecutors who built the case were doing their job. The jury that convicted him considered the evidence. The judge who sentenced him was applying the guidelines the law required him to apply. And 23 years of courts affirming that sentence were doing what courts do when the legal standard requires a specific outcome. Some of what happened to him was the system failing, a guideline that created a racial disparity so extreme that Congress spent a decade walking it back. A mandatory minimum so absolute that no judicial discretion could reach into it. A drug quantity so large that every reform mechanism built to correct the disparity still could not pull his number low enough. A man watching other people caught in his own case walk out while he stayed, not because he had done something worse, but because he had done more of it. The same number that put him in so deep that nothing could get him back out until a president with a constitutional pen and 3 days left in his term signed a piece of paper on a January afternoon in 2017. 56 kilograms, 23 years of motions, 28 years served, 1 signature. He was the 5th of 8 children raised in Tyndall Heights by a woman who worked at the medical center and always found a way to put food on the table. He wore cardboard in his shoes to keep the rocks out on the walk to school. He was a football MVP with pro scouts watching him before a phone call from Macon brought him home. He learned the trade in Los Angeles and ran it in Georgia and built something the government found large enough to name under the Kingpin statute. He lost everything to that sentence and spent 28 years inside a federal facility without a single violent incident on his record. He is standing in a room in Macon right now, telling teenagers not to do the math the way he did the math. Whether they listen is a different question. Whether the conditions that produced Tyndall Heights in the 1970s and that produced the crack economy in the 1980s have changed enough to make the warning easier to take are questions that do not have clean answers. He is still standing. That is the thing he has that no one can take back from him now.